We blijven even in het Engels verder gaan. Nodig ik mevrouw Valland uit om een klein inzicht te geven in de tools voor private land conservation. Miss Valland.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for the invitation here. First, I must say a bit of a context why I'm here today. It was actually the idea of Thierry Delescaille last week when we had the Green Week, and we had a session on engaging and rewarding private landowners. And he found this kind of interesting presentation, and I hope you will enjoy it. I apologize in advance; it will be in English, so I hope you will put up with me on that. So, what is first of all rationale of this the question? Our recent assessment showed that majority of habitats and species in Europe still have an unfavorable conservation status. And despite significant efforts, which were invested in past and we still invest them nowadays, now it appears that the current mix of support measures simply is not sufficient. On the other hand, we have limited resources in public budgets across Europe due to economic and financial crisis. For properties in private ownership, therefore, regulation alone cannot achieve an optimal land use which is compatible with conservation objectives. Private land conservation approaches are based on voluntary initiatives and can provide incentives, not command and control solutions. They go beyond the least common denominator of minimum conservation standards, and they can incentivize landowners to do more. Now, this is why the next to regulatory measures and existing incentives from public budgets, private initiatives to conserve nature and biodiversity could be really a welcomed complementary tool for nature conservation. Key question here is, what are the public policy mechanisms which are available for incentivizing private land conservation? Here we have a quick overview of what is available, what are the instruments which are available, from financial to social, labeling, certification, while in my presentation, I will center around these other incentives and legal tools, which are here on the bottom of the presentation. I will go through 5 cases or 5 examples of such legal tools and explain a bit on that. First one is the case or the example of privately protected areas. What is specific or what is known for this is that there is no commonly accepted definition of such areas in the EU, and even worldwide there is around 50 definitions of this. Now, privately protected areas are not simply publicly protected areas in private ownership. They are privately owned properties for which the initiative for land conservation comes from the owners themselves and not from public authorities or from some statutory duties. What is interesting as well is that, of course, the voluntary nature of PPAs, where landowners or land users protect their properties because of philanthropic motives, cultural, religious, or even scientific interest. Here, one of the most pressing challenges is what PPAs face is their legal conservation status. To date, only a few EU member states formally recognize privately protected areas as a distinct conservation category in their legislation. Here I have a case of Finland Arni-Kotka Forest Reserve, just that you know that there are some cases around still in Europe on that. Then we have second example, which are safe harbor agreements. And under safe harbor agreement, landowners voluntarily propose to implement habitat management measures, which are aimed at the conservation of threatened species or habitats. And in return, the landowner is provided with a so-called safe harbor guarantee, which is ensuring that no additional conservation measures will be required from the part of authorities, and no additional land, water, or resource restrictions will be imposed on him or her. So, in contrast to other market-based incentive tools, such as offsetting or compensation mechanism, safe harbor agreements are not directly linked to permit procedures. So they are not linked to projects which have a negative impact on nature, which means that they can really provide a real additional, even if temporary, benefit for nature conservation. I gave here a case of Netherlands. So there are different types of, different formats of these agreements. I gave here an example of Netherlands temporary nature one. Then the third one is the right of first refusal, where some of the EU member states have developed special rules to facilitate the acquisition of suitable conservation land when it comes on the market. And this is something which can be of a critical importance for private land conservation, where a conservation organization often encounters situations where they want to acquire a particular property or which is important to their goals, but owners are not interested to sell. And when conditions change and the owners decide to sell their property, a right of first refusal requires the owners to offer the property to the person who holds this right, so before offering to the others. This is quite common, actually. There are a couple of member states using this, like Denmark, France, Hungary, Italy, Germany, Spain, Slovenia as well. So this is one interesting one. Then we have conservation easements. This is actually the most common tool which is currently used in the US. And that's why actually we came initially to the debate on these legal tools. It's actually a tool of real property law, and they grant a right to a public authority or a conservation organization to restrict land use on properties which are not in their ownership. They function similarly to regulatory restrictions, but it's different in terms that it's actually a contract between two private parties. They usually run with the land, which means that they are binding for the present and all future owners of the respective property, and they can be very, very different, very heterogeneous in form and the scope. We have some cases in the EU, but maybe I would just like to mention at this point in time, so there is one case where it's actually the legal provisions or legislation which is explicitly providing for this type of easement, and that's in Scotland. They are called conservation burdens there. But otherwise, I would like to mention here that we have, under the LIFE program, the purchase of land as one of the measures, and this was actually the measure which actually was pushing towards the conservation-related entries in the property titles. But this went rarely beyond very general language in the property books. But still, this is something which may be considered as a start even here around. Then we have a fifth case or tool, which is conservation leases. They are a tool used by conservation organizations to gain temporary use rights. They are often alternative to actual land acquisition when that's not possible because too high cost simply, or because the owner is not ready to sell. So this can be a good way out in such cases. Or then second variant of conservation leases is where they are actually a mechanism for the conservation organization to delegate the management of a property to a farmer or a rancher or so. What is interesting is here that it's conservation land often leased below the market value. Now, I just mentioned now a couple of most typical legal tools which could be used, but I mentioned here one element which is very important, and that's that's tax or fiscal incentives, which not all the measures, or not all the tools which I mentioned would require such incentives, but the experience shows that they are much more effective if they are in one or another way linked to tax reliefs, be it for the landowners or for the donor of the rights, whether it comes to the reduction or exemption from inheritance and gift taxation, or when it comes to reductions in real property taxation, and also on the other side for the receivers, so for the non-profit conservation organizations. So this is an important element, and then I will show it on the case of the US and EU comparison. I'm showing it because US is actually, and then also Australia and some other developed countries have a much more developed tools for conservation in this respect. Now, if we look at the US, there is, of course, quite a different history, and you have a much different strength of the American civic philanthropic sector, which is a factor. Then also how they perceive land. They have much more freedom to use their land as they see fit, and so on. So that are quite some it's a different context. But anyway, the most common tool of private land conservation in the US is the conservation easement. But there are two prerequisites which actually pave the way for a widespread use of this conservation easement there. And that's, first of all, enabling legislation, which means that there is a legal definition of conservation easement, specifies who the eligible holders of such easements are, and so on, so all the legal provisions. And then second element, which is also important, is a favorable fiscal framework. In case you donate a conservation easement, which is meeting the requirement of the tax legislation, you are entitled to an income tax deduction for the value of the conservation easement. And in addition, also the value of your land can be reduced in the calculation of the estate tax. So this, and indeed, this tax deductibility of donated use rights was actually a trigger in US. Unfortunately, we don't have a presentation of a colleague he came from Lincoln Institute to explain this more in detail, but that was actually the trigger which caused such a widespread use of conservation easements across the Atlantic. Now, I just want to mention quickly also, we are working on these approaches as well. And we have, DG Environment, we have commissioned a study which will actually go into all the live projects which have possible examples of incentives and mechanisms in place for involving private landowners in the nature conservation. And we expect to have some cases, so real-life cases, and also to have some more information on how this is actually, if this is also something as a way forward for the EU, for us, or what kind of actions could be done in this area. Now, just as an initial assessment, because we didn't really, this was really kind of a first look into the area, and we have asked a colleague, of which actually I'm presenting the results of his work here. We asked for a first snapshot of what is the situation in the EU, and what we can see is the landscape of the instruments in the EU is highly heterogeneous. But that, of course, is also a situation which offers potential for knowledge exchange and seeking suitable case studies for replication. There is also, as for difference from some other very much from conventional support measures, such as agri-environmental measures, many of the promising approaches for the private land conservation are still in their infancy. And then also they are limited to a few member states, or there's a couple of pilot projects ongoing on that, but not more than that. And then, of course, we have also governance issues. To name just first is tax law and property law, which fall within competence of national governments. And so these are just a couple of issues which will also need further reflection and what I can say is just for the conclusion that public policy needs to create an environment in which private landowners feel that they benefit from a land conservation, or at least that they do not suffer a disproportionate burden. And these sort of instruments have a potential to open discussion and to kind of to be a complementary tool to that. Thank you.